This podcast is called COINTELPRO, not to reclaim a sleek rhetorical turn from the forces of reaction, but as a nod toward the real-world tactics that the state and capital use against any radical movement. That's because our broader project is to depict those tactics and earnestly discuss the strategies for overcoming them. The atomization of American society, the decay of its civic institutions, the retreat of the left into culture cannot be laid solely at the feet of state projects like COINTELPRO. Nonetheless, for over 100 years, the United States intelligence community has manipulated reality, infiltrated civic organizations, plotted insurgent violence, surveilled student groups, and spied on everyone who threatens the increasingly boundless interests of the ruling class. These tactics are nonetheless inseparable from a century of state surveillance and elite-led indoctrination. They formed the cornerstone of contemporary notions of individualism and distorted our sense of what we owe to each other. Starting in the 1950s, programs like COINTELPRO were used to criminalize and splinter dissident black and left-leaning organizations. That's because COINTELPRO was the product of a much older class consciousness on the part of the modern world's rulers and taskmasters. Indeed, anti-blackness is the foundation of elite ideology in the US, as it is in every place where African labor was coerced to feed the engines of commercial capitalism. Even the North American colonial state practiced its own brand of vulgar proto-bourgeois praxis, beginning with the first black codes, which were introduced to tamp down the Virginian frontiersmen and their growing coalition of black and white former indentured servants. Throughout the 20th century, informants and provocateurs, as well as federal and local agents, have kept their fingers on the pulse of dissident movements from within the very public and private spaces they occupy. The intelligence and law enforcement communities have plotted false flag terrorist operations, published pamphlets to sow dissent among groups building momentum, and even directed the assassination of radical black leftists, all within plain sight of the public. Remember, this is in stark contrast to the antebellum federal government. One of the remarkable things about the treatment of United States history is that it tends to ignore the practically whole-cloth creation of a modern bureaucratic state after 1865. Much is made of the historical continuity of the U.S. Constitution, despite the fact that the order it set out did not actually survive even to its centennial. It's not that this observation is based on particularly radical interpretations of the early republic. Instead, this reality is about the actual origin of the state, which has been submerged in our collective consciousness by a national cult that believes in a sacred continuity with the Philadelphia Convention. The cult of the U.S. Constitution has paraded the document's naked corpse through the streets ever since 1865, pretending that what they bear is actually the beating heart of democracy. A century later, the American population was simmering with discontent over an intensifying foreign conflict in Vietnam, a calcified racial caste system, and the squandered hope of mid-century political promises. And the modern state apparatus of the US government had fine-tuned its tools and mechanisms of propaganda, the infiltration of left organizations, and the hunting of radical black people. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, whites in urban areas colluded with the state to pacify a black population increasingly aware of the pernicious status quo. The tandem vigilante and state-sanctioned defense of white supremacy was filtered through the ideology and rhetoric of anti-Bolshevism, leading black leaders to be grouped with other subversives. Before COINTELPRO was formally authorized, the FBI surveilled organizations seen as black, leftist, and/or foreign-dominated. For the prior 3 years, urban upheaval spread to every major city as black communities rose up across the United States. In 1965, the Lyndon Johnson administration authorized wiretaps for the leadership of SNCC and the Nation of Islam. An FBI memo from the same year bragged that a factional dispute within the NOI, which had resulted in the shooting death of Malcolm X, had actually been orchestrated by provocateurs who had infiltrated the Nation of Islam. J. Edgar Hoover signaled his feelings about the Black Panther Party in the pages of a September 1968 issue of the New York Times, where he called the BPP the single greatest threat to the internal security of the country. In New York City, the Black Panther Party was formed mostly from former members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. The entirety of the New York BPP leadership was nonetheless imprisoned on charges that they planned to bomb police offices, department stores, and assassinate law enforcement officials. The Panther 21, as they were called, were held on $1 million bail while outside the walls of their cells, the BPP disintegrated. The Panther 21 were ultimately acquitted when Afeni Shakur, a BPP member who defended herself and her comrades against the charges brought by the state, identified the 5 police infiltrators who had in fact planned the spree of violence. Having suspected that these individuals were informants since before the leadership was arrested and charged, Shakur managed to get one of the infiltrators to admit on the stand that he'd never seen anyone in the organization plan or do anything violent, that in fact the only violence planned by the BPP had been by police infiltrators. Despite what Shakur's legal victory revealed about the methods and tactics deployed against black communists during the Cold War, nonetheless, over the next 20 years, the entirety of New York BPP leadership would be killed or exiled. At the same time, BPP leadership were being rounded up and prosecuted. A divided Democratic Party gathered inside the International Amphitheater for its national convention on Chicago's South Side.
Security people, well, as you can see, put me on the deck. I didn't do very well.
I think we've got a bunch of thugs here, Dan, if I may be permitted to say so.
Outside, an emergent new left clashed with police. Frank Tarugi Jr. was living on the near south side of Chicago in 1968 when he joined the protesters who arrested outside of the DNC. From a suburban Catholic family, Tarugi had attended a parochial Chicago preparatory school that was exposed to the liberation theology of the 1960s. Tarugi was a simulacrum of the New Left, a post-Bolshevik and neo-Marxist movement popularized in the U.S. as a reaction to the hard-right ideological defaults of the Cold War. Raised by progressive but solidly liberal working-class parents at a part of the 20th century when white families were rapidly migrating to Chicago's suburbs, he became enmeshed in the local activism of the late 60s as he moved between universities on the West Coast. In 1971, Tarugi was spotted by an FBI informant in Denver at a meeting for the Committee of Returned Volunteers. This would not be the last contact that would land him a file of FBI's COINTELPRO. In the early 70s, a Chicago Tribune reporter noticed Tarugi on the street corner wearing dark sunglasses in the type of casual but well-manicured fashion of the era, though the Tribune's coverage was merely a man-on-the-street survey, unconsciously documenting the project of gentrification already well underway in the South Loop. Tarugi was there to distribute a newspaper, which was published by the Chicago Area Group for Latin America. In 1972, a COINTELPRO brief on Tarugi called the Chicago Group a regional distribution center for the North American Conference on Latin America, a group whose members and meeting minutes were always neatly kept by COINTELPRO. Tarugi had been living on the south side in an effort to improve his Spanish ahead of an anticipated move to Chile, where Salvador Allende's socialist Popular Unity government had been elected by a plurality in 1970. Allende's election captured the imaginations of leftists around the world, both new and old, to flock to Santiago as participants in a democratized left movement. Tarugi went to work in Chile for the North American Information Front. While there, he worked with activists like Charles Horman and Steve Folk to translate the coverage of American media outlets into Spanish. On September 11th, 1973, after years of economic sanctions from the U.S. and the targeted divestment of private capital, the U.S. intelligence community and the bourgeois elements of Chilean society at last colluded with the military to anoint a coup d'etat led by General Augusto Pinochet. Despite extensive efforts at the time by some of the world's first human rights NGOs, it was not until a 2014 ruling by Chilean judge Jorge Zepeda revealed to the public that the FBI's COINTELPRO information about Tarugi found its way to the Chilean military through an organization referred to as the Military Intelligence Group for America in Chile, which backchanneled precisely this type of information from the US Intelcom to dictatorships in the Southern Cone. The stories of Afeni Shakur and Frank Tarugi Jr. underscore the extent of the intelligence community's efforts during the Cold War to sow division among dissident groups, to spy on leftist organizations, and even to task foreign actors with the execution of its citizens. There has been a tenor of anxiety in post-Trump America about the nature of truth and reality. Liberals have consoled themselves with deep breaths and thoughts of return to this status quo. While Joe Biden punts on a $15 minimum wage and Nancy Pelosi thanks George Floyd for his sacrifice, elites and policymakers continue to direct the state to spy, obfuscate its presence in our meetings, and to even plot false flag terrorist operations. If the left is ever to accomplish any meaningful change in this country, then it has to have its eyes open about the nature of state power and the tactics that will be deployed against us. This show will present reality as a contested narrative, one currently sequestered by the state and society's taskmasters. Our project on this podcast is to focus on the ever-widening chasm between the view of reality received from the culture and the information that's readily available in the public record. We will challenge and unnerve our listeners by asking the hard questions about progress and decline in the 21st century. We hope you'll follow our podcast and support our Patreon as we track down the people and the stories that challenge our understanding of reality and the nature of society. But this is also a show about what comes next. Neoliberals and even many leftists are very skeptical of big ideas about the future. This natural skepticism of big ideas comes from an implicit sense of comfort and security in the world as it currently exists. They understand that in a context of great change, that they might risk losing a great deal. Those who share that skepticism about the future are nonetheless its creators. The oceans will rise, and with it, the world will face crisis and rupture on the global scale. The wanton cruelties of starvation and exposure will creep even into the lives of those too comfortable to see it coming now. We mean to argue that this new world is already upon us, and once we understand the conditions under which this society is sustained, then we only require a conception of change that will allow us to claim a place for humanity in the next one.
Welcome, everyone, to the first episode of COINTELPRO. I'm Mike Spencer with our producer and co-host here, Austin, and we like to welcome you on in to what will hopefully be a long run for us on this show. We're starting this show with the goal of looking at particular events in the past in the public record, and also thinking about the world that we're likely to inherit as a result of those events and happenings. Austin, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're most excited about here in this opening run of episodes?
I think we are going to be covering quite a few really diverse and interesting topics, all of which are, I think, Michael and I have sort of talked about this. They're subjects that are seeming to sort of be coming to a head in the 21st century. And I think they're going to become increasingly more relevant, honestly, probably over the next 10 years. And I think we have an opportunity to really sort of discuss these subjects in a way that I think is going to be especially relevant to working class individuals. I think over the course of the 2020s, and I think we're going to be approaching a lot of these subjects from a much needed perspective from the left that hasn't really been, at least from my view, hasn't really been, I guess, sort of addressed yet.
Right. And I think that one of the through lines that we're going to be following on this show is this sense that I think a lot of us have of some sort of impending rupture out there in the near future, right? That the sort of pretenses of the world we're living in right now might not be as stable as they seem to have been or have been, even in the lives of our parents, and our grandparents, and that's one of the other things that we're interested in doing on this show is getting the perspective from people who are going to really live the next 80 years, right? People who are going to actually, deal with the longest term of those ramifications, for what's going on right now, and so that means that on this show we're going to talk about things like the intelligence community, like counterintelligence programs, like COINTELPRO, of course, but we're also going to talk about things in the deeper past, like feudalism and the Cold War and everything in between. And along the way, we're going to talk to artists and authors and other people who are thinking and creating, in the present, for the future. I think that may be what I'm most excited about. But what we have on tap here today is,
Sure.
I think, particularly timely as a portent of the future. We interviewed author and lecturer Bennett Tomlin, but we had this conversation about cryptocurrency about a month ago, which has only become more timely as since we've done it. I don't know, Austin. You have a little bit of crypto. You're a little invested. What describe for me your very normal thoughts on cryptocurrency before we started to think about this.
So, I mean, I kind of blindly got into cryptocurrency in terms of buying it a while ago, and I haven't sold it. I just kind of held on to it, and that was mainly because I hadn't really done much research into it. It was this new thing that everyone was kind of doing a year or two ago, and I saw it as an opportunity to, potentially make a little bit of money, and that was that. It wasn't really until recently that I became more, I don't know if disinterested is the right word, just sort of not exactly as enthusiastic about the world of cryptocurrency. And I think a lot of that sort of newfound apathy has arisen, obviously, because of recent events. So I just want to put it out there. I'm not a proponent of cryptocurrency, even though I currently own some. So
right. The reason I put the question to you is I think a lot of people are in that boat. I think that lots of people own cryptocurrency under those same pretenses, which is interesting. And I think that we're kind of in that phase now, where it's understood and known about on a popular enough level that the perfectly normal people, think, oh, this might be something that I'd invest in. This might be something that, that I'd like to diversify my portfolio in and all that sort of stuff. But there is an ideology there. There are sort of deep, economic ideologies that go into cryptocurrencies, right? And this is one of the things that we talked to with Bennett. But I think that what we're really going to get down to is talking about how that portent of the future, right, that cryptocurrency offers is a lot more complicated, and that the a currency that doesn't require a state actor or a third party to sort of verify sounds desirable on its sort of basic level, right? But or at least
sounds
it does
very
to a lot of
desirable
people.
for working class individuals.
Well, and that and I'm never so sure how much that like ends up factoring, but like it does seem like a currency that wasn't tied to the interests of a state, might result in a world where states and governments don't have the ability to, sort of marry their interests with, with finance, right? But past that, the sort of mode for democratizing, finance, is actually not that convincing, when you consider that most of the cryptocurrency that's ever going to exist, or at least of certain cryptocurrencies, are already owned by, a select few people. The structure of post-industrial capitalist society has already repeated itself, in the utopian world of cryptocurrency.
I think obviously probably an example that a lot of people are thinking of when Michael says that comes to mind is Elon Musk. And I'm sure a lot of people know Tesla basically just discontinued Bitcoin as a payment for Tesla products on their website. The news was the Bitcoin cryptocurrency market, I think they lost approximately $365 billion worth of Bitcoin solely because of that move. And I mean, that's one individual making a really sort of almost unilateral decision like that affects an entire market within hours. I mean, that's how much power already one person has over this new form of these new forms of currency that people think are democratizing and freeing. But I think a move like that really questions how true something like that actually is.
Well, and it doesn't seem like there's anything about a different type of currency that could really meaningfully change the preconditions for the inequities and miseries that people are afflicted with in modernity. And I think that and I really struggle to imagine like how the world gets better for a poor and hungry person if we've done away with fiat currencies, right? And I think that there's a lot of I don't think that this is terribly acknowledged in the world of people who do cryptocurrency, because it's kind of like it's basically it's very similar to how people who are really invested, who have the money to really be invested in cryptocurrency, it's a lot like how they talk about the stock market. It's just here's this asset that I own a certain thing of, and I'm hoping that someday it becomes more profitable, and makes me more money. But but there isn't, and there can be a lot of people from a lot of different sort of socioeconomic backgrounds who have that basic, thought, but there's nothing there, about, altering the current trajectory of society. There is sort of this, this desire to create the citadel of the cryptocurrency owners, where everybody else is just sort of begging at the gates for for scraps. So without any further ado, we will throw it over to that interview with Bennett on blockchain and cryptocurrency. But here's where things sort of take off, right? Florida prosecutors are apparently not buying those claims about a new payment system, and on Wednesday filed a second superseding indictment against Greenberg for embezzling $400,000 to purchase cryptocurrency for himself, wire fraud, and bribery. In addition to his first indictment, right, the one which has brought us here today, which included charges of harassment and stalking of a political opponent, and his first superseding indictment, which included one charge of human trafficking, several charges of aggregated identity theft, and misuse of driver's license info. Greenberg is now facing a combined total of 33 charges. So, Bennett, why don't you tell us why you're interested in writing about, investigating, and doing journalism on blockchain and cryptocurrency?
The reason I find myself interested in cryptocurrencies, blockchain, and the associated characters is because you come across a whole bunch of characters like our Mr. Greenberg, who seem to have tried to identify the subsets of fools they could, connived them using technobabble, and then used the ostensible veneer of cryptocurrency to justify classic scams and confidence games aplenty.
This would mean that Greenberg then is not an outlier in the world of cryptocurrency.
That would be my implication.
And joining us today, this is the voice of Bennett Tomlin. Bennett, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I am Bennett Tomlin. For my day job, I am a data scientist who investigates fraud in the pharmacy benefits space. And in my free time, I investigate fraud in the cryptocurrency space.
So double time for frauds and hucksters in Bennett Tomlin's world. Its basic level, what is blockchain?
Blockchains themselves are just combinations of transactions which are combined together into these discrete blocks. Each block contains a hash of the previous block so that you can determine its appropriate placement in the chain. And it is these combination of blocks chained together that gives you a blockchain.
How does that become a cryptocurrency?
The cryptocurrencies themselves are often ways to pay for or deal with the incentive systems that evolve around these cryptocurrencies. So if you're talking about Bitcoin in particular, in order to keep people incentivized to produce more of these blocks, you pay them a certain amount in Bitcoin for each block they successfully produce. And so cryptocurrencies themselves are just a method for maintaining the incentives for these blockchain systems.
And so all of these little blockchains are being endlessly mined, and the blockchain itself is just keeping track of these computational processes that are being completed by the computer.
Yeah, all a blockchain is a ledger. So it's just like used in accounting. All we're tracking is the movement of this thing from here to there. And because we've got this chain of the blocks in order, we can tell exactly how that thing moved throughout the whole path.
Why is cryptocurrency a secure, trustworthy, ostensibly secure, trustworthy method of transactions?
So generally, the reason people would think that about cryptocurrencies is because of the disintermediation. You are trying to eliminate as many trusted third parties as you can, and with the goal being that no one can censor your transaction. You can send your cryptocurrency to anyone you want, anywhere you want. And this is accomplished through these complicated consensus systems in these blockchains. And the reason they work is because, like in the case of Bitcoin, you've got a whole bunch of different miners who are all competing to be the next block on the chain. And so because of that, they are incentivized to try to both create the blocks and then get them included in the chain. So you can be reasonably sure that if you broadcast your transaction and it has a high enough fee, that it will get included in a block and your transaction will go through without you having had to put the same trust you would in like a bank or something like that.
So there's this idea of a third-party verifier in modern state, fiat currencies, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are there third-party verifiers in the world of cryptocurrency?
Yes, but it's a little more complicated. So if you're transacting directly on chain with most of the major cryptocurrencies, there generally is not a single third party with the ability to censor, remove, or whatever your transaction, which differentiates it from the bank. However, there is a lot of cryptocurrency transactions aren't occurring on chain. They're occurring on somewhere like Coinbase. And in that case, Coinbase is acting as the trusted third party like you would with a bank. And so for those cryptocurrency transactions, it's similar to using Venmo or PayPal, right? And then for the ones that do occur on the chain, there are still a whole set of attacks against cryptocurrencies that could make the assumption about whether or not your transaction gets included a little bit muddier. So the default assumption with these cryptocurrencies is that these miners that are producing these blocks are majority honest. And when you end up in cases where only a minority of those are honest participants in the network, meaning they're working to equally include the transactions, produce the blocks, whatever. When you have a minority of those, you lose a lot of the security assumptions inherent in cryptocurrencies. Then besides that, there's a whole other category of attacks where certain miners may choose to not include certain transactions if there's other ways for them to profit from it, and other things like that, which can challenge some of those assumptions about the security model.
We have this idea of miners, right? And not just Bitcoin miners as terms of somebody who owns a server, right? And who is invested in the mining of Bitcoin, but at the technical level, there are at the level of blockchain, there are miners, right? And these we talk about these miners or sometimes nodes, right, being incentivized to include transactions. Could you talk a little bit more about sort of what that means at the level of a normal person who's going to go out and make a transaction on one of these markets?
Sure. So a lot of this is generally going to be opaque to a lot of those users. You're not going to see the underlying working, but fundamentally, the amount of space in a single cryptocurrency block is limited. It can only fit a certain number of transactions in each block. And so whenever those blocks are full, you have to compete to get your transaction included in them. So the vast majority of cryptocurrencies include a fee that you pay on your transaction that is given to the miner to basically tell them that if you include my transaction in the block, you'll get to keep this amount of Bitcoin, of Ethereum, whatever, for doing that. So when you go to make a cryptocurrency transaction, you take a look at the current memory pool, at whether or not the blocks are full, and you set a fee that is hopefully high enough that your transaction will get included in a block.
At some point, your transaction will be the highest one within reach of one of these miners, and they'll incorporate it. And regardless, so even if it's a small transaction, eventually a miner will be incentivized to include that in their blockchain.
Hopefully. In certain cases, like Bitcoin in specific has relatively small blocks. Each block that comes out every minute is about about 1 megabyte with some additional stuff segregated off. And so you can only fit a certain number of transactions in each of those 10-minute blocks. And so in periods where Bitcoin price is moving a lot, there have been times where transactions can sit for days even, waiting for there to be enough capacity for your low fee to be worthwhile for a miner to include.
Talk to me about the fundamental differences between state currencies and a cryptocurrency.
Generally, the difference is going to be that, like fiat currencies, state currencies are going to be issued by a government, by the state, obviously. And the reason that those end up being valuable is because they're used to pay the debts and taxes for that nation. Cryptocurrencies often don't have a central issuer like that who is determining the monetary policy and things like that. Bitcoin, for example, when it was first released, had a certain emission schedule, inflation schedule, basically programmed into the protocol. And so far, that has largely been followed. And so there is no state making that decisions. There's no one making that adjustment. It just continues to emit at that rate. That is a little more complicated, though, than what that sounds like at first glance, because other major cryptocurrencies like Ethereum, you see a kind of social consensus that is required to dictate the monetary policy, where the amount given to miners has changed repeatedly with changes in the protocol. And even in the case of Bitcoin, where you often hear the words thrown around like immutable or things like that, and they love to talk about their 21 million Bitcoin cap. Years ago, there was an overflow bug in the Bitcoin protocol that resulted in millions and millions of extra Bitcoins being created due to a flaw in the software. And so when this happened, again, a social consensus formed and they rolled back the chain to account for that. And so even though there is still people involved, there's a social consensus that ends up dictating what actually occurs, like at that monetary level. So the difference really is, instead of a state being in charge of that, it's the community of that cryptocurrency.
Who makes up that community? Who has sway there?
Often it is the miners who are holding a significant sway in that conversation because they've put out the money, they own the machines that actually produce the blocks themselves. And so if you do not keep your miners satisfied and incentivized to create more blocks, then they are less likely to be honest participants in your network. The developers themselves who implement these changes in the protocol and in the clients are obviously party to these. And then the coin holders themselves often exert a bit of influence, because in cryptocurrency, when there's major disagreements in these communities, you'll see these protocols fork. So besides Bitcoin itself, you also have other forks of that, like Bitcoin Private, Bitcoin Cash, BSV, all of these things that took the original Bitcoin protocol code, forked it to create their own, changing whatever parameters they did not think were going in the right direction. And so continually in cryptocurrency, there's kind of this process of trying to create the set of proposals that will allow you to maintain enough of that social consensus that you don't see too many people forking off and leaving the community, right? And so that's kind of the soft dictator of that kind of social consensus.
The underlying principles that guide the creation of cryptocurrencies have in mind a creation of a separation between the arbiter of value and currency, separating that arbitration from the state, right? And that's a desirable outcome, for society. So tell us, what do those heavily invested in cryptocurrency want us to think that they're doing?
So there's a little bit of variation even among the cryptocurrency itself. I would say to a large degree, the Bitcoin community considers themselves somewhat separate from the cryptocurrency as a whole. And their version of the world is that in this kind of twisted version of Austrian economics they've adopted, Bitcoin is the perfect money. It is the most sound money, and that because of that, it will drive its own adoption by how much better it is than all other available monies. And as it does that, it will eventually outcompete all these other fiat currencies, which then eliminates this tool governments use to enact their agendas, their monetary supply, their money itself, and things like that. And that through that process, Bitcoin will weaken or eliminate the power of the state as a whole. That's the utopian libertarian version of what Bitcoin is going to do.
What happens to a cryptocurrency in theory as it ages? What happens to the value of an individual Bitcoin? What happens to the capacity of miners to access those Bitcoins? How does that process of cryptocurrency evolving? What type of society, is that creating around it?
As we mentioned before, Bitcoiners like to believe that they've got this hard 21 million cap, after which no more Bitcoins will be issued. And we're already at like 18.7 million or something. So we're a large portion of the way through the total emission schedule for Bitcoin. And we're already at the point where it might be net deflationary in terms of changes in supply, because every year a certain amount of Bitcoins are lost. Certain amount are burned and things like that, and that may already be enough to balance out the new supply issued to miners. And so then the issue becomes, in general, with deflationary systems like this, is that you end up with major Bitcoin holders basically owning in perpetuity a certain percentage of the total monetary supply if Bitcoin is to become money. So the kind of society you end up with is where the small number of people who own a permanently large percentage of this valuable asset end up accruing all this power and influence to themselves. And then you also end up with the tension with any deflationary system like this, where it can be difficult to appropriately incentivize a lot of the things we think of as good things, like productivity growth and things like that, because we have a permanent grant of a certain percentage of the supply to these basically feudal lords who control that.
And you talk about that idea that that a deflationary or non-inflationary currency might have adverse effects on society, and I think that sometimes this can strike people with sort of that portable collegiate understanding of economics or even of history, right? That there's an association with inflation, and in particular, runaway hyperinflation and negative impacts on society. In fact, oftentimes, and this is of course an intentional product of our monetary policy, we're fighting, and we are fighting inflation, but we're choosing to fight inflation because the outcomes of a little bit of inflation are better than the outcomes of no inflation or deflation, as we're talking about here. So in the 19th century, right, there are farmers in the American West, right, who were suffering because of a lack of inflation in the economy. When we have inflation, we have the value of debt that people hold is diminishing over time, right? It's because the dollars that were loaned to individuals who took on that debt, right, are now worth less as a product of the currency inflating, and that original number of loaned money is now less money than it was when that money was originally loaned. And so in the 19th century, a big part of the populist movement, a big part of the politics of farmers and of the underclass was in favor of a little bit of inflation, right, that would allow them to get ahead on these loans that they'd taken out on their farms and on their machinery and on their equipment, right? So, and in an inflationary system, there is a possibility that people can escape poverty, or at least outpace the the amount that they owe to lenders. It seems to me that the utopia imagined by people invested in cryptocurrency and blockchains, that world already has an aristocracy. That world already has its elite, right? And it would be the descendants of the people who own the vast majority of the Bitcoin.
Elon Musk.
Elon Musk does own, Tesla owns $1 billion worth of Bitcoin. Before we get into who owns it, I do also just want to mention that gold itself has an inflationary supply, right? Every year we mine more gold out of the earth. And so Bitcoin is breaking that assumption in many regards. So even that's one of the reasons why certain Austrian economists initially took umbrage with Bitcoin as an economic concept. It's because lacking even that little bit of inflation really makes the monetary supply difficult. And so in this case, is you have an incredibly small number of wallets, like holds the vast majority of Bitcoins. And we're not exactly sure who holds all those Bitcoins. A lot of Bitcoins, probably about 1 million or so, were initially mined by Satoshi Nakamoto, the pseudonymous creator of Bitcoin, who then disappeared a couple years after its creation and has not been heard from since. Beyond that, a bunch of other early miners were able to, when a lot more Bitcoins were being emitted per block, were able to secure a large portion of the supply. And so in that very early first phase, you've got a bunch of Bitcoin going to people who are interested in the anti-state ideas of Bitcoin, or who are cryptographers and technologists who are interested in this new distributed consensus network, right? And then you start moving into what I think of as like the Silk Road era, where the primary utility for Bitcoin came from its ability to be used to purchase illicit substances, right? Where you could go on Silk Road on the dark web and purchase drugs and get them shipped to your home using Bitcoin. So then you see a bunch of Bitcoin moving into the hands of people who would participate in that trade. Since then, you've seen a decent amount accumulate in a few institutions. So you're looking at like the Grayscale Bitcoin Trust, which is a instrument for accredited investors to gain exposure to Bitcoin. A bunch are held there. A bunch of them are currently held at the different exchanges. And then otherwise, it can be difficult to determine who exactly is holding these. You'll see these large wallets that will go offline for years and then come back online to do a couple of small transactions or something like that, to move them to new addresses and things like that. But we don't actually know who controls those keys. So I think what we can say at this point is that Bitcoin has a very skewed distribution. There's a small number of people who already hold a majority of the Bitcoin that will ever be released. And there's a whole bunch of people who have never even held a single Satoshi, the smallest unit of Bitcoin, right? And so we're already at that problematic distribution. And I don't see anything in the incentive design or in the structural design of something like Bitcoin where, if it were to succeed in the stated mission of the Bitcoin proponents, that we would ever see that break down or redistribute, or that small concentrated group of power would dissipate.
Is there any self-consciousness about that aspect of the utopian, Austrian economics reality of Bitcoin? There's a very clear and sort of cogent argument that gets made about fiat state currencies, about the benefits of peer-to-peer transactions without a third-party verifier, and these are all things I think which appeal and would appeal, not even just to people in sort of libertarian right, but anybody who has a desire to sort of see the expansion of a civic space, of individuals in that space conducting themselves freely and without the intervention of a state, right? But is there any self-consciousness about the world that you create by circumventing those traditional mechanisms for legitimizing a currency?
There's little. Earlier on, back when Bitcoin was used more by cryptographers, cypherpunks, and stuff like that, people would set up what they called faucets, which is if they had a whole bunch of Bitcoin, they would set up a website and you'd be able to get a small portion of Bitcoin, and they would take efforts to try to literally redistribute their holdings and give it to people. You don't really see any of that anymore.
So it would literally trickle out of a faucet then. This would
Literally,
be
yes.
the solution. Okay.
Yeah. And so there was a couple people early in Bitcoin's thing who were like, not everyone's going to want to mine this, but if we truly want this to be a currency, we need lots of people to have it. It makes more sense for me to put up a quarter of my massive holdings or whatever and say anyone who comes to this site can get 5 of these Bitcoins. This is really early on in the history, right? And for a while, when Bitcoin first started to really go up in value, when you first saw like Mt. Gox come out of the scene, there was a big push from some of the early whales to do a little bit of philanthropy, to donate some of their Bitcoins to support some charities and things like that. As the years have gone on, I have seen less and less of that instinct and more of people trying to protect their existing capital, as you would expect. Um, Occasionally, among other cryptocurrencies, I'm thinking specifically of Ethereum in this case, you'll hear serious people discuss why having a little bit of inflation is a good thing, why it makes sense to ensure that there's these other things in the monetary policy. But among Bitcoiners, I would say it's become more iconoclast over the years. And this has been amplified by the publishing of certain books like Saifedean's The Bitcoin Standard that really enshrine these pseudo-Austrian ideas into the accepted culture around Bitcoin. And so to deviate from that is seen by some Bitcoiners as like a deviation from the Bitcoin community itself. Because you are threatening what they see as their most sacred thing, their monetary supply that is set in stone. And that if you so much as question that, you are questioning the fundamental value of Bitcoin and therefore are a risk to the community.
And I want to sort of clarify the sort of hypothetical under which we're sort of waging this conversation, right? And this is taking the people invested in cryptocurrencies at their word, right? That they want to create this world in which you have a non-inflationary or even deflationary currency. In a world in which the population is ostensibly increasing, in which the productive capacity of the society is increasing, right? Then you have a finite currency accounting for all of that production. Then it means that the Bitcoins that exist in the world have to account for all of the productive capacity, all of the value that exists in that world. And so if we arrive at a future where, for instance, 5 people control 90% of the Bitcoins, and the value of the Bitcoin is only deflating, individual Bitcoins are worth more and more because they're having to account for more and more of the value that exists in the world, right? Then what you end up with is an entrenched class of people who got in at the ground level of Bitcoin, right? When these Bitcoins were cheaper, right? And through this deflationary process have built for themselves, a impenetrable golden cage, in which from which there is even less of an imaginary in which it might be broken down.
Yeah, and what you're actually getting at here is not something that is completely lost on Bitcoiners. There's this meme in the Bitcoin community where they discuss their citadel. And basically the idea is there comes a point, if Bitcoin is successful as the one world currency, where Bitcoiners would need to protect themselves from non-Bitcoiners by literally building a citadel, literally like the golden cage you were discussing. And yet they do not seem to have problems with that idea and actually use it as a meme to suggest that they need to buy more Bitcoins.
This is an infrastructure problem for them, not a social one.
As long as they're on top, they see no social problems.
Right. Okay. Okay. So we've sort of circled around, what we identify as the risks of the proliferations and the ripple of the utopian blockchain goal. Now I want to sort of transition to talk to you a little bit about the stilts on which the current cryptocurrency regime is trying to raise itself, to these utopian goals. Tell us a little bit about Tether.
So, Tether is a token that is supposed to be valued at $1. There are currently about 47 billion of these, and they represent one of the major sources of liquidity and volume in this industry, because many of the exchanges and businesses in the cryptocurrency space find themselves unable to get consistent banking. And yet, since there's still an expectation among their customers that they have something that looks like fiat currency, they've turned to these pseudo dollars like Tether to fill that role. Tether in particular is problematic because they have a history of lying about their backing, having unbacked tethers. And so to give some context here, the original concept with Tether is that each Tether token issued would have a corresponding dollar in a bank account. And so basically it was just a way to centralize the banking for a lot of these cryptocurrency businesses, right? However, Tether itself has struggled to maintain consistent banking and has often gone extended periods totaling months where they had no banking whatsoever. Because of this, there have been long periods where millions and millions of tethers are entering the market without the appropriate backing. Beyond that, Tether themselves has been in business with a whole bunch of shady businesses that exposed them. So for a period, Bitfinex and Tether, who are sister companies, were working with a Panamanian payments processor called Crypto Capital Corp. Crypto Capital Corp also worked with a few other exchanges, including Kraken, Quadriga, and BitMEX, but most of those, with the exception of Quadriga, realized pretty quickly that Crypto Capital Corp was not a legitimate business. Bitfinex and Tether decided to continue working with them, eventually giving them well over $1 billion without any contract or agreement. Crypto Capital Corp themselves was allegedly money laundering for the cartels. When they were arrested, the principals who've been arrested so far, they had fake bond certificates claiming to be worth billions of dollars, fake U.S. currency, the tools required to produce more fake U.S. currency, a second set of books labeled the Master Workbook, and a secret fund where they had embezzled about 10% off of all the money that had come into their business. Now, Bitfinex and Tether were working with this business because they didn't have banking, but wanted to continue to provide this pseudo shadow banking service to the cryptocurrency industry as a whole. My specific fears with Tether is that because it represents the majority of cryptocurrency trading volume, and because it is such this major source of liquidity, and they have created what I think of as a large regulatory attack surface. They've done a whole bunch of things that are going to be of interest to U.S. regulators. They have made it such that U.S. regulators, by attacking Tether in particular, can have knock-on effects across the cryptocurrency industry as a whole. This has been compounded in recent months with exchanges like Binance deciding to collateralize their futures with Tether, meaning that Tether is now also an instrument of increased leverage throughout the system, meaning in cases where Tether becomes worthless, the effect on other cryptocurrencies is magnified. Returning to one of our previous points, one of the reasons people are interested in cryptocurrencies in the first place is that there is no single central party who can censor your transaction. When you're using a cryptocurrency like Tether, this is no longer true. Tether, the issuing body for Tether, has the abilities using their keys on each of the blockchains they issue on to freeze all of the tethers in circulation. Tether is now that trusted third party who can censor all those transactions. And therefore, the US regulatory bodies are the person who can censor all those if they can get their hands on those keys. And so the cryptocurrency industry as a whole has tried to present themselves as possessing a certain level of maturity in terms of the financial world, of being established and having these certain fundamental values that would enable them to prosper. And yet they have exposed this whole attack surface from the entity, the US government, that they claim to want to unseat and unthrone, which tactically seems like a poor decision, but is the current status of crypto. Generally, if you're on like Coinbase or Gemini, you're going to be trading like Bitcoin into US dollars because there's a whole secondary level of exchanges that don't have access to US banking. They instead use Tether. So you're trading your Bitcoin on the exchange for tethers, and then the tethers can be transferred between exchanges, still acting largely like dollars. And so the goal here is to basically allow traders to keep the price of Bitcoin consistent across exchanges by taking advantage of differences using Tether to arbitrage, or to be able to trade into something that acts like a dollar on these exchanges without access to dollars.
I'm curious, like, if there's any sort of analogy that can be drawn, that might, between, sort of, because I think I kind of understand this idea now that Tether is, is for the markets where you're not trading Bitcoin for the US dollar, right? So that you need, in this sort of liminal space, right, you need something to tether the value, of the Bitcoin. Is there an analogy that we can make that people might?
So I think the clear analogy for me with Tether is going back further in history to the wildcat banks, right? To these unregulated banks that were issuing dollar-like currencies that were backed by some set of assets that were still used because there was lack of a better alternative for a certain set of people and businesses, right? And you do kind of see a similar interaction with cannabis and things like that, where access to the legitimate services has been impaired. And so people turn to these ways around it. Now, generally with Tether, it's not the same type of interaction where like you're simulating an ATM transaction basically with your debit card at the dispensary. But it's similar in the sense that these services exist, at least in part, because legitimate access is difficult for these businesses.
So I'm assuming then, right, that every Tether is backed by a dollar then, right?
That is an assumption lots of people make. Not every Tether is backed by a dollar, and Tether no longer insists that every Tether should be backed by a dollar. Their current stance is that the value of the Tether reserves, as valued by Tether and containing whatever Tether dictates, should be worth as much as the number of circulating Tethers.
Is there an acknowledgement that something like Tether is the third party that cryptocurrencies are working so hard to eliminate?
Among a small percentage of people, they'll acknowledge that Tether is not in line with the stated cryptocurrency belief system. But I think if you were to press most Bitcoiners, they would eventually get to the point where they admit that Tether goes against the values of cryptocurrency as a whole. However, they see it as a transitory mechanism that potentially accelerates the ability for Bitcoin to become the one world reserve currency, for Ethereum to become the chain that secures all these different things. For their utopian vision to be achieved, they think allowing Tether to exist for now makes that more likely.
I want to kind of transition to talking about, that thing that's probably led to more cryptocurrency talk on more podcasts than anything ever before, and that's this idea of the NFT, the non-fungible token, which isn't a great name. I think everyone's decided, but maybe start out
fungible.
maybe start out with who is Ethereum in relationship to everybody we've been talking about? Because if anybody, listening to this that isn't super familiar with this, we've thrown around a lot of funky Silicon Valley sounding terms today. And now we've arrived at non-fungible tokens and Ethereum. So demystify this a little bit for us.
So Bitcoin was the first meaningful cryptocurrency, and its general utopian vision is this stateless money. Ethereum was created several years later and is now the number 2 cryptocurrency. It is meant, whereas Bitcoin is meant only for these transferring of values, Ethereum is meant to allow fundamentally any type of computation on this distributed set of computers. So yeah, Ethereum is another cryptocurrency. Its chain is meant to allow for these Turing complete for any type of computation to occur in this distributed censorship resistant manner. Non-fungible tokens in particular is all that means is a token on a cryptocurrency network that is unique. And that's really all that non-fungible means, because fungible means you can replace two as if they're identical. So non-fungible means you cannot do that. And so when people are saying that, really all they mean is a singular unique token that means then something else.
Whereas most cryptocurrency tokens are the epitome of fungibility. They literally just are a reference in themselves to the one before.
That's the general perception of them, that any one Bitcoin will be worth about the same as any other Bitcoin. This has gotten somewhat complicated in recent years as governments and law enforcement have gotten better at tracking the activity on Bitcoin, Ethereum, and other cryptocurrency chains. There are now certain coins that are often considered kind of tainted because they were known to have been used to finance terrorist groups, used as part of a hack, stolen or something like that. And so those are really no longer fungible because those are going to be valued by the market as less than other Bitcoins.
So we're recording this this podcast here right now, and let's say that it's and it's a work of art, right? We think that there might be some value that we could get from taking the MP3 file of this podcast and making an NFT out of it. How would that work? What would we practically be creating?
First of all, you will most likely need to get registered at one of the platforms that makes it somewhat easier to issue an NFT. Different platforms have different standards for who they'll accept. Some will let just about any make an account. Some try to be more curated and take in only a certain caliber of artist. Then you take the product itself. In this case, it would be the MP3. In another case, it could be a JPEG or a PNG, and you upload it somewhere. The default option is just a regular web server or something like that. Though there are newer alternatives that allow you to use something like the interplanetary file system, which is a cryptocurrency network that distributes storage space. And so if you upload something to that, it is then a little bit harder to take down or change. But most NFTs are just first, the art itself is uploaded to a web server. You get a URL, a web link that links to that, and then you create just a very simple token using one of these services that contains in the data that link. And then someone buys that token that contains that link, and then they can look inside their wallet and see that they can own a token that contains a URL.
Right. So a URL. So if we refuse to release this podcast on a regular feed, and this podcast was only available at that hosted web server, right? And maybe you could only get to that URL, through the token itself, right? That could, for someone, maybe if it wasn't our podcast, maybe if it was, for instance, a Wu-Tang Clan album, that might have value for people, right? Because it's an audio file, it's an MP3 file that you can, possibly, if we set it up this way, you could only hear it there. You could only hear it at that hosted web server. That would have some value, right? What about an NFT of a painting, of an oil painting that hangs on the wall? What value, what relationship does that blockchain have, that URL have, with a painting that might hang on my wall?
Generally very little, without a whole bunch of like real world meat space contracts and legal documents surrounding it. For example, it would be possible for you to put that painting inside a trust or some similar financial vehicle and then write up the rules and bylaws of whatever to say that the possessor of whatever token you created then is the rightful owner of that trust, which contains the painting and all that. But then that claim still needs to go through the normal legal system. There isn't really any meaningful sense right now of an NFT implying ownership of a real life object or something like that. So what you really have is a token in your wallet containing a URL that points towards a JPEG of the painting.
To what extent do you think that NFTs are a part of this utopian blockchain idea? And to what extent is this just an effort to open up more market share to cryptocurrencies?
NFTs have always been tricky for me because I've never really been like that type of collector. I was never one to really try to collect all the in-game skins for a video game or try to get all of a certain baseball card or something like that. But I know there's people who do value that kind of collection, right? And Martin Shkreli buying the Wu-Tang Clan album so that he can be the only one to own it is a thing that a certain type of person values. And so I see something like NBA Top Shots, which is taking these officially licensed clips of these NBA games and making people the owner of them. I can see basketball fans being interested in something like that. Generally, the types of people interested in that are probably different from like the hardline Bitcoiners who see the stateless money dream. And that's also why I kind of wanted to separate out Bitcoiners from the rest of the cryptocurrency community as a whole in the beginning, because most of the other people who would consider themselves members of the cryptocurrency ecosystem are not necessarily hardline libertarians whose only dream is to remove all fiat currency. That's a pretty largely uniquely Bitcoiner phenomenon. But I can see it. I can imagine ways in which it's a useful tool for a subset of artists to try to sell exclusive access to certain art pieces, to make certain digital art feel more exclusive, because that's often a struggle that digital artists will experience. And so I can see how that is consistent with disintermediation, with removing middlemen, with trying to remove some of those external structures, and fits in with that more classic cryptocurrency idea. However, the practical reality I've seen with NFTs so far seems to be a lot of related party dealing, speculation, and just largely a mania that has existed as a way for a small number of people to enrich themselves. I mean, you look at the sale at Christie's of that one NFT that went for like $69 million, right? The largest NFT sale ever. It was sold to the guy's business partner who he had launched a cryptocurrency with, but they tried to hide that fact. And that artist's like last block of 20 NFTs that he had sold before that were all bought by that same business partner under a bunch of aliases. And like, that's the kind of thing you see when you scratch a little bit deeper in a lot of these cryptocurrencies things, is you see the initial idea and you're like, yes, this is interesting. This is potentially good. Censorship resistant payments are a potentially good thing. Distributed computations, no one can stop, seems like a thing that could have value. Having this token people can collect seems like a thing people would be interested in. But then when you look at the particular implementations that have come out, the particular cases that have happened so far, often instead what you find is just someone who's looking to use that thin veneer of those ideas to justify them, using basically classic scams, self-dealing confidence games, and things like that just to enrich themselves.
The American archetype, right, of the huckster, right, of the scammer, of the guy waiting around the corner to sell you the Brooklyn Bridge.
The classic structure of the American con is you first present something that seems at first glance too good to be true. You can't possibly be making this much from this little, and it defies belief. And then you take a couple of steps to build your trust with the mark. You show them that you've got some special ability, some special insight, some special knowledge that makes you uniquely able to get this unbelievable thing. Then you wait until the person wants that thing, and then you start to take them in through that process. And so you find ways to gradually take more and more while convincing them that they're still on the path towards the thing. So the example that you'll see sometimes with like the yellow kid who operated out of Chicago is you convince them that you've got a ringer horse that you've been running one horse that looks identical to your fast horse, but is a slow horse in the races. And so now the odds are up to like 25-1, and you're going to drop in your ringer in just a couple weeks and make money because this horse looks the same, but it's so much faster. And so you take and people go, what? You're obviously not going to get away with that. So you take them out to the track and you show them your horse just running incredibly fast around the track. And then in the lead up, before you get to the big poll where you take the most of their money, you start trying to drain them. So I want to get you in on this, and I can get you in on this bet when this horse flips. But until then, we're going to need to pay to have a place to train this horse. We're going to need to make sure that we're able to pay the jockey. And I had a judge who was going to call no contest if our horse loses, but he's threatening to talk to the police. So we're going to need a couple $100 to pay him off. And so as you go along, throughout these classic American scams, you get gradually taken more and more in. And as you go along, you become less and less likely to question it because you have become more and more invested in it. And you've gotten the occasional proof that suggests to you that we're on the right path. You've gone out again and you've seen the horse, and that horse is still fast. And what you don't know is that the day of the race, they overfeed, they overwater that horse, whatever. It's actually the same horse the entire time. They just make sure that when it races, it can't go fast because the goal is for you to lose. And so then you finally go for the big score. You get people to commit a big chunk of money to buy your conference ticket, and then the conference never happens. The horse loses the race, and try as they might, the people can't get their money out of it. The reason this worked for a long time in early American history is because there was this concept in the law that if you entered into a contract with clear eyes, like with an understanding of what the risks should be, or if it was like a thing like horse racing where if you were setting out to fix a race, you can't rat on someone else who didn't successfully fix a race. That doesn't make sense. And so you see again that same kind of thing occur in cryptocurrency. Are you going to go to the cops and tell them that when you sent those Bitcoins to that drug dealer on the form that you didn't get the drugs you were promised? Or they promised I was going to get 20% returns per week if I lent them this Bitcoin, and I never got my Bitcoin back. Well, yeah. And so you rely a little bit on kind of people's unwillingness to admit that they've been hoodwinked, bamboozled, had the wool pulled over their eyes as instrumental to your thing. And so taking it back to cryptocurrency, you first set up your pitch. And when they come to you with questions about this doesn't seem believable, I don't understand how I could get these returns, you hide it under this veneer of the technobabble, under the cryptocurrency language that convinces them, wait a second, maybe this is legitimate, maybe this is special, maybe this is my chance. Along the way, you drain them for what they can, and then when given the opportunity, you pull the liquidity, you take what you can out of it, and a bunch of people are left with worthless claims and a bunch of shame. And what we're really getting into kind of here is that these stated ideals of Bitcoiners and of cryptocurrency as a whole are not what they truly believe. Most of the people who own Bitcoin and Ethereum do not own them because they believe in some stateless money, because they want that kind of thing to supersede all else. They buy it because they expect it's going to go up in value, and eventually they will be able to sell it to someone else who will still want it.
The reporter for the New York Times tries to, he reaches out to this company and he's like, why did you guys buy my column? And like, this doesn't make any sense. You spent $740,000 on a mundane New York Times column. And they go, basically they admitted that it was a speculative buy. They were like, we wanted to have the first New York Times NFT. But it's just, they bring up the point, the interviewer, another reporter for the New York Times, is basically just like, it's staggering to see people just throw around money on just dubious nonsense like this.
My favorite part about that example in particular is that the New York Times NFT was sold and the proceeds were all donated to organizations that help support journalists. And so you have these gentlemen from Dubai who just donated $750,000 to charities to support journalists. Which
that's excellent.
It was speculation,
Well, it's just fascinating because you wonder, I think from this point on, what else rich folks are gonna speculate on with NFTs.
Everything.
So, like, what, is someone gonna? You're right. Like, what sort of just insane thing is someone going to buy as an NFT?
They're gonna buy this podcast. That's.
I've already seen people who've sold NFTs that were just a single pixel. I saw one person who was able to create a corrupted PNG file that was 0 pixels, and they sold that. Mm-hmm. I saw another person who sold like a recording of a fart. Whatever thing you can think of that you think, no way anyone's dumb enough to have made an NFT out of this. Someone's probably tried.
When does a crazy group of people buy a defense contractor as an NFT and steal a bunch of weapons of war and stuff like that?
Or
2025,
right? Or somebody who says, "Hey, I have the code necessary to start a fire sale in the U.S. State Department."
Right.
Here's the NFT that'll link you to that virus that you can upload from your laptop.
Right. Or a person who buys like a company that makes a bunch of like weaponized drones or something like that, as an NFT. I don't know. To me, it's just like, it's like kind of terrifying.
This is an independently produced podcast. You can support us by subscribing and help us make more episodes by going to our Patreon page. We'll see you next week on COINTELPRO.